This is going to be a slightly unusual thing. I'll be presenting a history, but it's not going to be mainly or only a history of recent times, because there are certain complexities we need to understand. Whenever you read mainstream media of the West, you find them saying that there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism. What they mean is that Zionism is being criticized. I'm going to make a distinction between Zionism and anti-Semitism, and I'm going to say that rejection of Zionism can in no way mean being anti-Semitic. It's absolutely fine if somebody says that the state of Israel does not have a right. It's very difficult if somebody says, very unacceptable if somebody says, these Jews are killing the Arabs and therefore down with the Jews, which sometimes does happen, not maybe here. So this map by now is well known, but we are going to go back to its prehistory. The claim of Israel is from this, that there was a kingdom of Judea, and that's why Jews have a right to this area. Now the kingdom of Judea was conquered by the Romans, and after the revolt of Bar Kokhba, many Jews were expelled from there. This area became a contested one between the Persian Empire and the Roman empires, and ultimately fell under the sway of the early caliphs. Some Jews continued to live there and elsewhere under the Mamluks in Granada, which was a part of what is now Spain, and elsewhere. Abdul Fattah Ashur, professor of history at the Cairo University, states that Jewish people found solace under Islamic rule during the Middle Ages. By contrast, when you look at European Christian history, it's very different. The Reconquista, or the Christian conquest of Spain, was followed by the persecution of the Jews. The Ottoman Empire was a refuge for Jewish refugees after the fall of Granada, the edict of expulsion and repression by the Inquisition. If you again look at this map, these are the areas from which Jews were expelled at different points of time. And these areas, the Ottoman Empire, Maghreb, these are areas where the Jews could actually live relatively better. I'm not saying they were never oppressed there. Arab cities had Jewish quarters, whereas the 1215 Lateran Accords required Jews to wear something distinctive, such as a hat or the yellow badge which is shown in these pictures. European Jews had few career options. They could not own land or farm. They could not join most guilds. So they worked as merchants, peddlers, jewelers in glassblowing arena, and sometimes they were used by the nobles as moneylenders. This in turn created the image of the Jew as the exploiter, who was the moneylender. For nearly 2 centuries in early medieval Europe, the Khazars may have had a Jewish kingdom. Russian historians asserted that Mosaic elements in early Russian law came from the Khazar influence. Anti-Jewish prejudices resulted in Jews being expelled from most areas in Western and Central Europe beginning in the 12th century. Edward III of England, for example, threw out all Jews that he could locate from England. Jews were driven from their homes and fled eastward, especially to the then more tolerant kingdom of Poland-Lithuania. Tragically, in the 18th, 19th centuries, these areas in turn would become anti-Semitic, and Jews would find going tough in these areas. The Enlightenment challenged the centrality of the teachings of the Christian Church. The French Revolution led to the full Jewish emancipation in France. In the 19th century, with the rise of nationalism, anti-Semitism shifted from being rooted in religious terms to being framed in more secular terms. Earlier, a Jew was somebody who professed the Judaic faith. Now, if you were the descendant of a Jew, you were a Jew. So Karl Marx's grandfather, for reasons of his own, converted to Christianity. Karl Marx was an atheist, but for Hitler, Marx was a Jew and communism was a Jewish conspiracy. New nationalist ideologies further led to the rejection of Jews as unwanted foreigners, not citizens. In the 1870s in Germany, Wilhelm Marr and his fellow anti-Semites did not believe that people stopped being Jewish if they converted to Christianity. For them, Jews were members of the so-called Semitic race. Race theory, as a so-called scientific theory, developed especially in the 19th century, whatever their religion. So hatred of Jews for religious reasons was now joined by a new idea that Jews were an inferior race. This belief led anti-Semites to support the notion that Jews should leave Europe. This resulted in different ideologies emerging among the Jews as well. The extreme forms of anti-Semitism. This is Alfred Rosenberg, one of Hitler's ideologues, who wrote that Europe will have its Jewish question solved only after the very last Jew has left the continent. This was Rosenberg in 1934. Rosenberg was hanged after the Nuremberg trials in 1946. So among the Jews, you get different positions. The traditionalist of the Orthodox, who rejected much of modernity and wanted to cling to doctrines and practices from the past. One famous example of their orthodoxy was that one of the most significant modern figures of the Enlightenment, Baruch Spinoza, who was a critical-minded Jewish intellectual, was expelled from the Jewish community because of his views. Then you had the Jewish liberals. Many of them wanted equality and assimilation in the different countries where they lived. You had the socialists, both international Marxism and in East Europe, the Jewish Bund, a socialist organization trying to organize Jewish workers in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, were significant forces. And then you have Zionism as a Jewish version of nationalism. Isaac Deutscher, a Jewish dissident Marxist activist and historian, says about Zionism that in the West, in the late 19th, early 20th century, socialism, liberalism, and Zionism were benevolently related to one another. But in Eastern Europe, right from the beginning, they bitterly competed for the loyalty of the Jewish masses. Jewish left-wingers argued social revolution will give the Jews equality and freedom. They have therefore no need for a Zionist messiah. The Zionists, on the other hand, dwelt on the deep-seated hatred of non-Jews towards Jews and urged the Jews to trust their future to nobody other than to their own state. So this is how Zionism came into existence in Europe as a kind of Jewish response to emerging modern nationalism. And Zionists insisted that Jews had to be seen as a nation with a common language and descent. They insisted that the hatred towards Jews in Europe made it imperative for them to get a homeland in Palestine, which they called the land of Israel, given by their God to their ancestors. These are from the Torah. In Deuteronomy, you find, even if your exiles are at the end of the heavens, the Lord your God will gather you from there and he will take you from there. And the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your forefathers possessed, and you will take possession of it, and he will do good to you, and he will make you more numerous than your forefathers. And in the book of Ezekiel, we read, and you will know that I am the Lord when I bring you to the land of Israel, to the land I lifted my hand to give to your forefathers. The problem is that a literal acceptance of the Torah has its own problems. In Deuteronomy, once again, we are told this is an instruction being given to the Jews. Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, in order that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. And in Joshua, there's a description. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave the loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged right in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. So accepting this kind of an ideology becomes a problem. The problem does not lie in Judaism, the problem lies in a very specific way in which it was being explained. For the Zionists, one of the central slogans, as Edward Said tells us, is that what they wanted was a land without a people, for a people without a land. Because the Jews are a people, a nation without a land, and Palestine is an empty place. This, however, is the historical memory of Palestine, which Palestinians have gathered. There are books in which these pictures have been reproduced, memoirs have been written about how the Palestinian Arab areas look like. This is Jaffa before Israel existed. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was a turning point for the Zionists because this was a public statement by the British government in 1917 during the First World War, announcing British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Mind you, Palestine was then an Ottoman region with a small minority Jewish population. So before any Jewish homeland, this was going to become a British colony. An imperialist aim was embedded within that. So after the First World War, Palestine became what was called a mandate territory ruled by the British. I show you Palestine's demographics from 1914 to 1917. The figures are all in thousands, and you can see that up to 1947, the population of Jews was much less. But you can also see that between 1931 and 1947, the Jewish population rapidly increases with David Ben-Gurion organizing systematic movement of Jews to Palestine, and up to 1939, the Nazis providing a push factor. The Jews were encouraged to sell their property and get out of Germany and move to Palestine. What happens then is the creation of what Edward Said and a number of others have called a colonial settler state. There's a distinction between the kind of colonialism that we have seen in India, where a foreign country sent its troops, conquered the country, had a bureaucracy ruling over us, but from their country. A colonial settler state is what you have when you claim that your God or whatever manifest destiny says that this is for you. A couple of days back, there were all these Thanksgiving Day posts on Facebook, which you have seen, by Americans, that they were thanking God for having given them America. Now, America wasn't an empty land when they came. An American professor of Palestinian Jordanian ancestry who specializes in Native American history, a man named Stephen Salaita, has carried out a comparative study of Native American literature and Palestinian literature and made this analysis explicit. So Zionists developed an ideology which called for the total exclusion or elimination of the non-Jews. Patrick Wolf, a leading scholar of settler colonialism, says, at times this ideology of settler colonialism actually entailed genocide, for example in the United States, where the Native Americans were almost wiped out. At other times, ethnic cleansing in a heavy scale or an oppressive regime denying natives any rights. On the other side, I have given all the examples. This makes Israel less sui generis. This also shows why older colonial settler states and their ideology commits them to strong support for Israel. Now, the Jewish migrations begin from 1882, long before Hitler and the Shoah, which was one of the greatest tragedies that has happened, but not the greatest. The way you will constantly find it, I'm not trying to underplay what happened to the European Jews. But you find references to the Shoah. You do not, for example, find many references to King Leopold in Belgium because they were only blacks who were being killed. A greater number of people in Belgian Congo were killed than Jews in the Holocaust. Actually, I prefer the Shoah because the Holocaust refers to a sacrifice. The Jewish term is more accurate. Starting 1919, the Palestinian National Conference tried negotiating with both the British and the Zionist movement. In 1928, the Palestinian leadership actually agreed to equal representation of Jews and Arabs in future bodies of the state, though the Jews were a minority. The Zionists thereupon rejected it. The result were riots, a number of Jews were killed in Hebron, a greater number of Arabs were killed in a number of other cities. As late as 1947, however, the Palestinians suggested a unitary state to replace the mandate to the UN. Neither British imperialism nor the Zionists cared for what the Arabs wanted. In 1936, the Arabs organized a general strike followed by a revolt in 1939. This was put down by the British. One of the things that we are constantly told is that the Grand Mufti supported the Nazis. Now, one of the things about nationalists during the Second World War was that they all supported the side which was opposed to their own imperialism. I do not think that there are many in India who would assume that Subhash Chandra Bose was a fascist just because he had an alliance with the Japanese. So the Grand Mufti's alliance with Hitler was something of the same order. In 1947, the UN General Assembly proposes partition of Palestine by majority vote. Incidentally, both India and Pakistan voted against that. Now, right-wing anti-Semitic politicians had no problem supporting Zionism. Winston Churchill, who was an anti-Semitic politician, I have given a long quotation from him. I am reading out just little bits. Talking about socialism, he says it was the schemes of international Jews. The adherents of this sinister confederacy are mostly men reared up among the unhappy populations of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing. So, Jews, international conspiracy, this is all very anti-Semitic. But then he goes on to say, if there should be created in our own lifetime by the banks of the Jordan a Jewish state under the protection of the British Crown, an event would have occurred in the history of the world which would be especially in harmony with the truest interests of the British Empire. So two contrasting positions are shown here. When Martin Buber wrote to Mahatma Gandhi asking for his support for Israel, this was Gandhi's reply, which he also printed in Harijan. My sympathy does not blind me to the requirements of justice. The cry for the national home for the Jews does not make much appeal to me. The sanction for it is sought in the Bible and the tenacity with which the Jews have hankered after their return to Palestine. Why should they not, like other peoples of the earth, make that country their home where they are born and where they earn their livelihood? On the other hand, you have the most extreme Zionists. I am quoting one of them here, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who wrote an essay, The Iron Wall. We cannot give any compensation for Palestine, neither to the Palestinians nor to the other Arabs. Therefore, a voluntary agreement is inconceivable. All colonization, even the most restricted, must continue in defiance of the will of the native population. Therefore, it can continue and develop only under the shield of force, which comprises an iron wall which the local population can never break through. This is our Arab policy. To formulate it any other way would be hypocrisy. For many years, this would not be the mainstream position, but increasingly, as governments in Israel have shown, all the way to Netanyahu, this is increasingly the position. In 1944, the land acquired by the Zionists in Palestine still amounted to not more than 6.6% of the territory of the British Mandate. But Zionism had emerged considerably strengthened from the war. Between 1945 and 1948, several of the militias, the biggest being Haganah, but also the Irgun Zwei Leumi, joined forces in attacks against the British occupation as well as the Arab population. This was a major hotel where the civil administration of the British Mandate was based, and under the command of the future Prime Minister Begin, the Irgun planted enough bombs here to destroy the hotel, the way you can see the picture. On 29th November 1947, UN Resolution 181 was passed, which can be summarized as the partition of Palestine into three zones: an Arab state, a Jewish state, and Jerusalem to be placed under international control. Around 55% of the territory was given to the Jewish state, even though the population-wise the Jews were much less. At the end of 1947, Haganah, Irgun and Stern Gang, now joined in a united effort, unleashed a campaign of terror with a series of coordinated attacks on Palestinian villages with dozens of civilian casualties. The attacks increased in intensity in the first months of 1848. Tanura, Tire, Sasa, Haifa, Far, Husseiniya, Sarafand, with hundreds of Palestinian victims. As a result of this terror campaign, magnified by threats and rumors spread by the Zionists, hundreds of thousands of unarmed Palestinians fled their homes, which were later razed to the ground to make their return impossible. But I do need to mention a less-known sponsor of Israel at this point because it played an important role. The Soviet Union, the Belarusian and Ukrainian SSRs, Czechoslovakia, Soviet ally Czechoslovakia provided arms, ammunition and military training to the forces of the Jewish Agency and then the Israeli government, which included 2 shipments in the spring of 1948 when the Zionist forces were desperately short on both arms and ammunition. These shipments were decisive given how poorly armed and equipped the Palestinian forces and the armies of the Arab states were. This is a picture of Haifa where the Zionist militia is coming in. In 1967, after what is known as the Six-Day War, Israel absorbed practically the whole of historical Palestine as well as additional territory from Egypt and Syria. By the end of the war, Israel had expelled another 300,000 Palestinians from their homes, including 130,000 who were displaced in 1948. So for them, this was the second time they were thrown out and gained territory that was 3.5 times its size. So when people are told that Hamas began it on 8th October, that is entirely due to our short memory. After the 1967 war, the poet Nathan Alterman wrote, "The meaning of victory is that it erases the difference between the state of Israel and the land of Israel." Alterman thundered that anyone who returns these pieces of land will first have to write a different Bible. Palestinians do not want to write a different Bible. They question the right of the Bible to dictate they are being turned into refugees. Now, in order to cut short, I'm just providing you with a timeline. April 1948, you have the Deir Yassin massacre, which was a huge massacre in a village by Zionist paramilitary forces. In May 1948, Britain terminates the mandate. On 15th May 1948, there's a unilateral declaration of Israeli independence. This is the official day of the Nakba or catastrophe. It's significant that the Jewish term for what Hitler did to them, the Shoah, means catastrophe, and the Palestinian term for what happened to them in 1948 is the Nakba, which is also the catastrophe. Europeans murdered, butchered other Europeans. Europeans then decided to assuage their guilt by dumping those Europeans on West Asian peoples, getting rid of these other West Asians. In December 1948, the UN Resolution 194 calls for refugees to be allowed to return. In 1950, Israel moves the capital to West Jerusalem, defying the UN. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is founded. It included a number of specific organizations, the biggest of which was Fatah, whose historic leader for a long time was Yasser Arafat. In 1967, the Six-Day War, which I mentioned, and Israeli annexation of huge territories. In 1974, the UN General Assembly recognized PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to eliminate the PLO. But the Israeli army always has a problem fighting on ground because the Israelis do not want to lose too many soldiers. So they prefer places where their air force can carry out, or where it's an empty place where they can use cannons from the long distance. So after a few days, they realized that fighting on the streets was becoming expensive for them. So there was a ceasefire. The PLO moved out. After that, in two camps, Sabra and Shatila, there were massacres by the IDF, the Israeli army, and its phalangist allies in Lebanon. In 1987, you have the first intifada at the Jabalia refugee camp. In 1988, Arafat says that the Palestinian National Council accepts United Nations Security Council's resolutions 242 and 338, which effectively gives up the claim that there should be one democratic unitary state where Jews and Arabs should live. Instead, he is willing to accept the two-state solution. But Israel shows after the 1993 Oslo Accords that there is not going to be a Palestinian state, even a separate Palestinian state, which will have full rights as an independent state. Over time, Fatah, which transforms itself into the Palestinian Authority, which is still the formal government in the West Bank area, into a quisling government, which is why it loses popularity, and in the early 21st century, Hamas would replace it as a popular organization in Gaza. When you have legislative elections in Gaza, Hamas wins the elections, whereupon Israel responds by imposing blockade and sanctions. From 2007, Gaza has been under a blockade. Not a grain can enter without Israeli permission, and on one side, it's the Egyptian government in collusion with the Israeli government, which ensures that the Palestinians cannot operate independently. In 2008, 2012, 2014, you have Israeli military violence in Gaza. In 2016, even the UN Security Council, given the United Nations States' role, the UN Security Council seldom passes any resolution strongly critical of Israel because there will be a US veto. But in 2016, even the UN Security Council called Israel's activities violations of international law. Yet, after 8th October, this time, in the General Assembly, 121 countries demanded an immediate ceasefire. The resolution also demanded the release of all civilians held captives. 14 countries opposed it, and 44 countries, including India, abstained, which has been a complete reversal of position for India since the original positions that India has held. The Indian government also argued that the resolution did not condemn the terrorism of Hamas. Is terrorism the most important issue in this moment, or is it the lives of the thousands of Gaza residents who are being constantly bombed by Israel? So whose terrorism is terrorism? Terrorism is a way in which a solitary act causes fear or terror in a large population that's not directly or immediately impacted by that act, instilling in them a fear of uncertainty and that it can happen to them at any moment. So when a government and its army ties a civilian in front of a car, this didn't happen necessarily in Israel. I'm sure you recognize where it happened. And uses that civilian as a human shield, that is not called terrorism because it's the state which is doing it. A large population can be intimidated by creating terror. Governments use this technology of terror. For example, when on a normal day in the West Bank or in Gaza, Israeli settlers entering the house of a Palestinian and killing them is also a terrorist act. Israelis have committed these acts repeatedly over the last 75 years, but there is no outcry over these regular acts of terror. This is a recent picture of a man outside a hospital with his child who is dead. The US president and his cabinet have argued that the cowardly Hamas is hiding among the Palestinians. So what can poor Israel do? It's forced to kill these Palestinians. The Israeli anti-Zionist historian Ilan Pape thinks differently. Pape, now a professor in UK, has called Israel's activities the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and he sees Gaza, policed by Israel, as the biggest prison on earth. These are two of his books. This is the chant, which is not a call for murder of Jews as it is sometimes portrayed in media, including recently in the Telegraph by an Indian MP. This simply means that there should be a free, equal, democratic Palestine. In ending, let me read out a few lines from a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, who has been called the national poet of Palestine. In a letter to Edward Said, written in January 1983, a few months after the invasion of Lebanon, Darwish wrote about his longings to wring all the necks of my rhetoric, and he started writing in a different form where you have a minimalist poem. Our losses, from 2 martyrs to 8 every day, and 10 wounded, and 20 homes, and 50 olive trees, in addition to the structural defect that will afflict the poem and the play and the incomplete painting. We store our sorrows in our jars, lest the soldiers see them and celebrate the siege. We store them for other seasons, for a memory, for something that might surprise us on the road. But when life becomes normal, we will grieve like others over personal matters that bigger headlines had kept hidden. When we didn't notice the hemorrhage of small wounds in us, tomorrow, when the place heals, we'll feel its side effects. This is translated by Elias Sandberg, the historian. Thank you.